Well, thank you all for hanging with the dense material that we had last week. You know, cramming a whole systematics course on plant taxonomy and the organization of families and the characteristics of the key families is really hard to do in an hour. It's a lifetime's worth of work that's impossible to condense. So we're going to talk today about the habitat perspective and how when you go into the wilds, into nature, understanding what habitat you're in, what ecosystem, what assemblage of plants you're looking at in their environmental context, understanding that habitat perspective will clue you in to what plants, what wildflowers, what flowering things you might see in the natural landscape. So we talked about, a number of these things on the slide, but first of all, what is a wildflower technically? Well, it's something called a forb. A forb is a term that describes an annual or a perennial, a plant that grows year after year after year, that's herbaceous, meaning it's not woody. It's not woody, it doesn't have stem material or branch material that when you break it, snaps like a twig that's crackable and actually snaps. An herbaceous plant, you think of something like a grass or something like a mustard, something like a poppy that isn't woody. Now, it's not a shrub, it's not a tree, it's not what's called a geophyte, which is a bulb, something that grows from a tuber or a corm or a bulb underground, a geo as in the geology and phyte as in plant, or earth plant. So a forb is something that's herbaceous, not woody, and it actually can be a geophyte, like a calochortus, a fairy lantern, or a Mariposa lily. We also talked last week about what a native plant is. And again, that's sort of a cultural term. It's a term that we've developed to help us understand at a moment in time what has been introduced to our environment by people. And the powers that be in the botanical world have chosen the start of the first European or the date of the first European visitors to California to identify the point at which plants that were introduced into our environment become not native to the California environment. And that really is an anthropomorphized kind of concept. And, there are a lot of people that take umbrage with that, something that might be introduced. I don't know. What about something that came from South America on the wind or in a big storm or on the currents from Eurasia that circle the polar areas and come down the coast of California in the cold California current that arrived right before the first Europeans, but technically wasn't evolved in California. Something that arrived right before the Europeans still would be considered native. And I kind of have issues with that, but that's the way it is. So we talked about what a wildflower is. We talked about what a native plant might be. Now, what about a natural community, an ecosystem or a habitat? Those are technically plant assemblages that you must consider in an environmental context. Plant assemblages that interact with things in their environmental context, like insects, soil fungi, birds, mammals, physical things like fire or floods. So natural communities, ecosystems, and habitats imply an interaction of some organisms. It's not just plants, it's not just, insects, it's the whole assemblage of things that work together. And usually we sort of characterize those by the plant assemblages. We talk about forests, we talk about woodlands, we talk about savannas, grasslands, shrublands. Those are descriptions of plant assemblages, but those also imply natural communities, the collection of organisms that work together and interact and depend on one another to function as an ecosystem. Now, I like to think about habitat indicators or indicators of certain kinds of environmental contexts. And usually those indicators, at least the ones I work with the best, are plants. So an indicator to me of an oak woodland might be a coast live oak or a valley oak. But to say, an indicator for an avian biologist, that might not be an oak tree, it might be a certain kind of bird species. Or to someone who's a herpetologist, it could be the indicator of a certain ecosystem is a particular kind of lizard or a salamander or, maybe a snake. So indicators are just typical of their environmental context. So when we talk about plants and plant assemblages, understanding what the indicators are of certain habitats really gives you 10 steps forward in understanding what other plants you might see. Likewise, if you see an indicator, you know what habitat you're in. All right, here's a very hard to interpret vegetation map or habitat map of the San Lucia Preserve. You see the patterns in general, the greens and yellows and the light colored habitat types. When we map vegetation or habitat types, we group these plant assemblages according to their indicators. So Monterey Pine Forest at the top, there's a very small little bit, and I can't even really see it. It's like in here somewhere. It's the pink here at the top. We're grouping that plant assemblage, identifying it by its indicator, a Monterey pine. Grasslands are much easier to see on this map. They're this beige. There are all these zones here that are indicated, typified, identified, described by the fact that grasses, could be native, could be non-native, dominate. So you get that drift that I'm trying to describe. Plant habitat areas are identified by their indicators, and the indicators are things that our minds grasp readily because we've sort of studied these. We're familiar with these. They're part of our lexicon. Now, what about wildflowers? Wildflowers in these habitats and just understanding wildflowers. Well, we know based on last week's lecture and the first lecture that all plants have certain kinds of characteristics. These particular wildflowers on this page are totally different, stunningly beautiful, incredibly complex. From the wind poppy here on the top left, with its incredible orange separated petals, typical numerous stamens of the poppy family that identifies the Papaveraceae, to this really complex flower here of the columbine with all these extruding stamens in these compartments in the collection of petals that's called the corolla, really complex, a member of the Ranunculaceae, the buttercup family. Or this in the middle drooping fairy lantern with its 3 pale petals and the 3 corresponding sepals that identify it as a member of the lily family. complex arrangement of individual flowers in the inflorescence, stacked up in these groups here on the Chinese houses, the collinsia. And then a member of the dandelion tribe, the chicory tribe of the Asteraceae. I'm not really sure what this flower is, but it has tiny little disc flowers in the center and numerous ray florets or ligules, sort of indicative of the Asteraceae, complex flowers and inflorescences. And we learned that, oh my gosh, to really dig in, dig deep, get a handle on what individual species might be, we have to have some sort of understanding of all these different leaf shapes, what arrangement they are. Are they clustered together as a compound leaf, or are they singular as a simple leaf? Do they occur in a palmate kind of, or where's a good palmate one? I got to get close. Oh, down here on the lower left, a palmate kind of arrangement or a pinnate kind of arrangement. What do the margins look like? What do the veins look like? All these characteristics help identify individual species, as do the inflorescences, all sorts of different times. The types of inflorescences, the inflorescence is the collection of flowers. We look at something like this plant here, this collection of flowers, and we think, oh, that's just a flower, but it's not really, it's an inflorescence. As is this spike here of the very rare native orchid. These are all individual flowers, but when we look at this collection is called the inflorescence. All different sorts. So here in Monterey County, when we have this, growing habitat perspective, we really are blessed with an incredible variety of different plant assemblages that reflect the diversity of topography, the diversity of geology, the microhabitats, the variety of precipitation regimes and fire regimes that we have in this county. It's all around us, and we're blessed that it's so complicated and so diverse. Really lends itself to having the diverse kinds of plants and the numerous plants that we have in our county. The highest point in the county is Junipero Peak, 5,800 feet. Doesn't seem like that's very high relative to the Sierra Nevada, but it really is for coastal California. Junipero Peak, being so high, is like a sky island. It has plant species that are far more typical of, say, Sierra Nevada types. Sierra Nevada or other mountainous areas, much higher in elevation. We have things like sugar pine with these awesome cones. We have things like incense cedar up there. But we also have weird stuff like these bush mallows. These bush mallows that don't occur anywhere else on the planet except for around the San Lucia Range. This grouping of bush mallows in the San Lucia Range is actually about to be further divided, not into Malacothamnus palmeri variety whatever, but different unique species, because people are learning that they are individual species as opposed to varieties of the same thing, because we have DNA sequencing now and we can really refine and hone how we identify plants based on their genetic relationships. Also at these high elevations, we have really cool things like Lewisia. Lewisia, the bitterroot. This is variety minor. These flowers are the size of my thumbnail. They're tiny, they're diminutive. Bitterroot is something that occurs at higher elevations, but we have it here in the Coast Range because we have these sky islands of much higher elevation relative to things around us. And, maybe these are Pleistocene relics. Maybe they're left over from a time when Glacial advance reached our coastal areas. And no, we didn't have glaciers here, but we certainly had persisting snow for long, long periods of time. This is a really cool plant. When this plant, Lewisia rediviva, not the variety minor, but the regular one, Lewisia rediviva, was collected at the first time, or for the first time, it was collected during the Lewis and Clark expedition. And it was named after Lewis. And they collected all these plants, months and months, maybe years of plant collecting. And then eventually it made its way back to the Midwest. And when the plant press was open, all these collections were sorted and looked at. And I don't know why, but for some reason, the Lewisia specimen they'd collected, a little bit of water dropped on it or something, and it revived. So they actually called it Lewisia rediviva. It's like revived Lewisia. It's like pretty cool. So immediately on the coast, the highest point immediately on the coast range, the front range, is Cone Peak, 5,100 feet. Again, it doesn't seem that high, but these higher elevations in the Santa Lucia range really are unique. They are sky islands. Cone Peak is furthermore interesting because it has the steepest coastal gradient. In other words, the steepest elevational gradient per the horizontal distance away it is from the immediate coastline. It has the steepest elevational gradient along the entire west coast of North America, except for Canada and Alaska. So between the coast and the top of Cone Peak, it climbs an elevation over an amazingly short horizontal distance. And because of that, there are tremendous gradients of change. And along those gradients, an amazing array of plants. Cone Peak does get snow. It does persist. And it also supports sugar pine, incense cedar, and this amazingly interesting Santa Lucia fir, Abies bracteata, which is the rarest fir in the world. It occurs nowhere else except for our coastal Santa Lucia range in a very short north to south population distribution. It's really cool. It grows in these rocky, craggy, hard to get to places that generally don't burn in wildfires because they're rocky. They don't support a lot of vegetation. This particular fir species does not thrive with fire. In fact, it's completely killed with fire. So it takes a long time to recruit into burned areas where it has died. It's also called the bristlecone fir because it has these really cool bristles that extend from the cones. The cones are always at the very, very tallest part of the tree, and you can't climb them. They're too spindly to get to. Really cool things. Cone Peak and the environs also support numerous weird stuff like Cyclodenia humilis, which does not have a common name. It's a really cool plant that's super pale. It's reflecting sunlight in its really rocky environment. So it isn't impacted too much by insolation by the sun rays. It retains moisture that way by reflecting light and having a light color of its leaves. It's actually related to the invasive plant vinca. It's in the same family, the dogbane family. And it kind of vaguely looks like vinca in a way, that cursed non-native. It's a really cool plant. It's beautiful, and it only occurs at these high elevations around Cone Peak in super gravelly environments. So we have these high elevation environments that support these sky island plant assemblages of unique things, but we also have, not in Monterey County, but just over the Diablo Range in San Benito County, a relictual Mojave Desert plant assemblage, which is persisting in a very unique location that's basically the same latitude as Cone Peak and Juniperocera Peak, but it's in this rain shadow of the Diablo Range. And it speaks to a time during past, climates when Mojave Desert-like environments reached well north. So we have this assemblage of Mojave Desert kind of plants and Mojave Desert kind of soils and climate, weather patterns. And what I'm just trying to bring up here is that these microenvironments occur all over the place. There are pockets of plants that just reflect different climatic patterns that occurred who knows when, and they persist because the environment that they thrived in somehow persists to this day in unique settings. So from high elevation to these weird, Pleistocene relictual pockets of vegetation in unique climates, let's now go on sort of a transect across Monterey County and look at wildflowers from the coast to other habitat types. So the dunes on the coast, these are familiar to us. We think dunes, oh yeah, okay, they're all sand, but no. Native dune habitats should be and were primarily vegetated environments. There were blowouts, there were areas of shifting sands, there were areas where the substrate was highly unstable, but by and large, dune habitats along the California coast were vegetated habitats with things that are familiar to us. Lupins like this and poppies like this, but although these are familiar, they're not exactly regular poppies and not exactly regular lupins. And in the dune systems, there's also these odd things. This is a mushroom, indeed, we know that. It's a fungus, but it's an odd mushroom that is adapted to sandy environments, to sandy habitats. We're not going to find this particular species of mushroom in a grassland or in a forest, only in the sand. So these familiar things like lupins and poppies and mushrooms, how do you decide what species they are? Well, because you've had lecture number 2 in this series, you know about plant families, right? And the complexity of plant families. Well, all of these with 4 regular petals are in the Brassicaceae, the mustard family, formerly the name cruciferae, with their cross-like 4-petaled flowers. This happens to be a member of the Brassicaceae called Cacali maritima, the sea rocket. It is not native to the California coast. However, it was introduced so long ago that it is almost native. In my mind, it's become, quote unquote, naturalized. This member of the Brassicaceae family living in the dunes has a really interesting reproductive strategy in that here on the top, you can see the seed pod. The seed pods up here are divided in 2, like a 2-stage rocket. This part that protrudes on the outer part of the seed pod, filled with seeds, is really light. It's almost hollow inside. When the plant is mature and the seeds are ready to be dispersed, this outer part, I lost my mouse. Where'd it go? There we go. This outer part that's light and hollow, filled with seeds, detaches and is launched to be carried by the wind or the tides to somewhere far away from the mother plant. That's a mechanism of dispersal. This part here, this heavier part of the 2-stage rocket seed pod, this heavier part stays attached to the plant for a long time. And when it drops, if it drops really close by because it's heavy. So this plant is seeding itself near to the mother plant, but it also distributes itself far and wide with this, launched, lightweight, floating, or carried by the wind seed pod. It's just fascinating. Now, how do we know what kind of lupin this is? We know, first of all, it's a lupin because it's a member of the Fabaceae family. It has these classic flowers in the inflorescence with the banner in the back, the wings on the side, and a keel of joined petals in the middle. When it matures, it has seed pods, like a pea or a bean, as do all members of this particular family. So knowing these plant family characteristics helps you hone in on what species you're going to potentially find in these, what individual species of these genera you're going to find in these particular habitat types. So it's understanding your environmental context, understanding what families might be there, what indicators you might see, and then knowing how to use the keys in particular to identify your individual species. You know, really cool things occur in the dunes, like these verbenas. We have pink verbenas and yellow verbenas, these verbenas with these inflorescence types that are umbels, all these individual petal cells joined at a particular location with deep, thick roots, tuberous roots that anchor these spreading plants to these shifting sands, anchor these low, prostrate, spreading plants, getting them out of the wind, helping them cover these loose sands and stabilize them. Interestingly, we have the same kind of verbena here in the Salton Sea depression, where the soils are alkaline. They're not necessarily salty, but they can be. So understanding the environmental context, helping you understand what plants you might see, what indicators you might see in similar environments. Here in the dunes, the beach primrose, again, spreading, prostrate with characteristic what are called stolons or runners that come from the mother plant and root at the nodes. These are overland stems, if you will, that are capable of rooting at the node and creating a new plant, like a strawberry. These stolons or runners, these overland stems, typical of sandy, loose substrates where this plant is found. It's a classic adaptation to this dune, sandy, unstable environment. How do I know this is a primrose? Well, I'm familiar with the family and the characteristics of the family. They have these pom-pom pistils right in the middle. They're always pom-pom shaped or capitate. Oh, that's a fancy word for something pom-pom shaped. Capitate or head-like. Yeah, capitate, like decapitate. That's like take your head off, right? Capitate, head-like. You got to find ways to remember. Here's another really interesting wildflower you find in the dunes, the beach morning glory with these kidney-shaped leaves right on the sand with this campanulate or bell-shaped flower that's typical of this family. And again, like the verbenas, it has a long, tuberous, thick, fleshy root that anchors it, that holds moisture in these environments. They're moist because they're by the beach, but they're not freshwater moist, they're saltwater moist. So any kind of fresh water that falls on these loose sands percolates through quickly and is lost to the roots if they're superficial, unless they can catch it right away. Therefore, these deep, fleshy, tuberous roots that retain moisture. A beautiful eriastrium, kind of a hard word to say, eriastrum. It's a hard word for me to say, with these cool cobwebby leaves. Look at how these stamens protrude. They're tempting pollinators. They're waiting for pollinators. They're making themselves available for pollinators in an environment where getting pollinated might not be easy because it could be windy by the coast. Could be a salty, foggy day by the coast that suppresses insect action. So they're doing whatever they can to be pollinated so they can continue to live. A member of the Asteraceae, a flower that grows, or a forb, I should say, that grows in dune habitats, the seaside daisy, Erigeron, is a very widespread genus in the Asteraceae family, but Erigeron glaucus is the seaside daisy. with these typical composite flowers with these ray florets or ligules and these disc florets in the middle, each one going down to a single seeded ovary like our sunflowers. This is often used in the horticultural trade in landscaping because it's pretty easy to grow. A dune flower that I really like, Castanea latifolia, restricted in population to the dunes. This is a paintbrush. It's a paintbrush, but it has really rounded orange bracts. These little yellow things are the flowers. We'll talk more about paintbrushes in a minute, but these really interesting orange bracts that characterize all the Castaneyas, all the paintbrushes, are indicative of plants that are what are called hemiparasitic. They partially parasitize other plants. They don't have a lot of chlorophyll. They can make their own food because they have a little bit of chlorophyll, but they don't have a lot. So they parasitize other plants. These are cool things. These are cool succulents that occur in dune habitats and in our coastal cliffs. Two different species, Dudleya cespitosa and Dudleya farinosa. How do you really tell them apart? Well, Dudleya farinosa is kind of pale, it's fair. That's the way I remember. These are unfortunately being poached in great numbers by people who are selling them on the black market, on the black horticultural trade market. They're highly valued in Korea, of all places, and in parts of Asia. They're super, super, super easy to grow from seed. So why people are poaching them and not growing them, I guess it's easier to poach something than it is to grow it. But they're really easy to grow from seed. And unfortunately, we're losing them on our California coastline because of illegal horticultural trade. Really interesting members of the Brassicaceae, again, the four-petaled classic cross-shaped. Here are two members of the Erysimum genus, Erysimum ammophilum, the coast wallflower, and Erysimum menzesii, the Menzies wildflower, named after Menzies, a Scottish botanist. Now, Erysimum menzesii has two subspecies, very interesting. One, Erysimum menzesii subspecies menzesii, only blooms from March to April. Pretty early, it's about to start now, and it only occurs in the Asilomar dunes. It's endemic, only occurs in the Asilomar dunes. The other, Erysimum menzesii subspecies yeadonii, blooms later, in May to September, but it only occurs in the Marina dunes on the other side of the bay. So go figure, how does that happen? These two species of the same genus have been isolated in these dune habitats for long enough that they have developed different flowering periods. And they also have unique leaf structures. Look at the leaf structure of this coast wallflower and this upright inflorescence as opposed to this squatty kind of spatulate leaf structure of the Menzies wallflower, which is a much smaller in height plant. It's just fascinating. So how would you tell these two apart? Well, first, environmental context. Are you in Asilomar or are you in Marina? And then, of course, secondly, all these plant characteristics that you now can identify as being unique to these different species, these different leaf shapes, and this different inflorescence height. It's all part of the package that goes along with identifying plants. This is a federally listed plant, Gilia tenuiflora, subspecies arenaria, very, very rare, with these exserted stamens here. The more common variety, Gilia tenuiflora, subspecies tenuiflora, has these stamens that tuck farther down. Here you can see them exserted. They tuck farther down into the collection of petals called the corolla. They tuck farther down in there. Now this is interesting to me, subspecies arenaria. This is called sand gilia. And what's this word in Spanish? Arena, that's sand. So there's something being told here. There's a story about this plant. There's an adjective that describes this plant. in this specific and subspecific name, arena. It's the sand gilia. I just love that. There's so much information in these names. Likewise, how do you know what kind of poppy you're looking at? If you're in the dunes, you're looking at a variety maritima. It has a much more orange center in the petals, as opposed to these more pale outer portions of the petals compared to a regular poppy. And this coastal variety, variety maritima, here again, this adjective is telling you a story about where it lives, a maritime version. So there's dune habitats, there's these coastal scrub habitats that we talked about, coastal scrub habitats that are dominated by shrubs of all different sorts. You know, once you know the environmental context, you know what to look for. You know what to look for in terms of your mock heathers or your lizard tails that look really familiar. You know what to look for in terms of black sage, which occurs in a lot of different other habitat types with these really interesting tiny flowers that are grouped together in inflorescences that are stacked up along these stems. Coastal scrub also includes shrubs like sticky monkey flower, which recently was reclassified from a Mimulus genus into the Diplicus genus. Diplicus, the genus that describes the monkey flowers that have no little pedicel or stem that connects them to the main stem. Far more common in other kinds of habitats, but occurring on the coast and coastal scrub. Now, how do you tell that from other monkey flowers? Well, environmental context. Here's sticky monkey flower. Here's a monkey flower that you find in wet habitats, seep spring monkey flower. Environmental context. Here's a monkey flower that you find in inland chaparral habitats. Here's a monkey flower, San Lucia monkey flower, that you only find in high elevations of the San Lucia. And then here's a really cool one. Look at this one, Fremont monkey flower. It's like one of the only pink ones. And you see the different genera, Diplicus, Diplicus, Diplicus. Those are the ones that don't have the little stem that attaches them to the main stem. They don't have a pedicel attaching them to the main stem, as opposed to this word that's really hard to say, the Erythranthe genus, Erythranthe. These, and it's kind of hard to tell, I don't have a good picture of that. These are attached to the main stem with a pedicel, with a little stemlet, if you will. They're superficially very similar in terms of their, you know, plant characteristics. They're all bilaterally symmetrical, but look at the different colors. And of course, understanding the environmental context, you know what to start looking for. When you visit the chaparral habitat, this is dominated by the shrub chamise, Adenostoma fasciculatum, a member of the rose family. A member of the rose family that each little individual flower is a perfect replica of a rose with all the characteristics of a rose, grouped together in these white inflorescences that are really quite showy when they're blooming. When they're going to seed, they're a beautiful rust color. I really like it. It's brown, rusty color. It's just lovely. They have really interesting sclerophilous or tiny reduced leathery leaves that are adapted to our Mediterranean type climate, summertime heat and wintertime moisture. They resprout readily from the base, what's called a lignotuber or a burl storehouse of tissue that resists, endures fire, has these specialized buds called epicormic buds that resprout after they're damaged by fire. It's an adaptation to periodic burning that's related to a fire regime, a particular pattern and a particular seasonality over long periods of time where these plants have adapted to dealing with that kind of disturbance. Now, there are lots of manzanitas we find. Manzanitas occur in chaparral. They also occur in maritime chaparral, the version of the chaparral shrub-dominated habitat that is restricted to very particular coastal settings. All these different manzanitas have particular characteristics. They superficially look the same. They all have these fused petal corollas, these campanulate or bell-shaped flowers, urceolate or urn-shaped flowers, kind of a synonymous word. Superficially, they all look the same. They all have berries. Some have super fuzzy leaves. Some are attached right to the stems. Some have fuzzy twigs. You can learn to key these out, but knowing your environmental context, knowing where you are in the state and which maritime chaparral population you are in Santa Cruz or Monterey or down the coast in San Luis Obispo or parts of Santa Barbara County will clue you in to what species to look for. This is kind of a cool, I wish it was a little bit clearer. Here's a manzanita that I found in Pebble Beach that had these beautiful pink flowers, fused corolla, 5 petals, or I think it's 5 petals, might be 6, 5 petals fused in this urn-shaped or bell-shaped flower. And it was turning color because it was being influenced by a gall. A gall is almost like a wart. It's actually a fleshy change in the DNA growth pattern of tissue that's caused by a wasp or a fly laying its eggs on that tissue and secreting a substance that actually stimulates hormonal change to actually change the color of parts of the plant. And sometimes you see that in leaves. In this case, you saw it in these flowers, and it was beautiful. I'd love to have something like that in my garden. Ceanothus, another really cool flowering shrub, typical in chaparral, as well as in coastal scrub habitats. This is a really big one. Ceanothus thyrsophloris, called blue blossom, or sometimes California lilac. In this case, the thyrsophloris is identified with 3 midveins on the leaf. 3 midveins on the leaf. Compare that to these other Ceanothus species, which are a lot more uncommon. Ceanothus cuneatus, Ceanothus dentatus, Ceanothus incanus, the coast whitethorn, incredibly fragrant, which reaches its southern distribution in Fort Ord. This one has 3 midveins, but these 2 only have 1 midvein. And that's an interesting story because the 3 midvein Ceanothus have a lignotuber or a burl, and they sprout after fire. These single midvein species of Ceanothus do not resprout readily after fire. How do you know which one you're looking at? Well, first you got to know your environmental context. Where are you in the county or in the state? What habitat are you in? And then you hone in. Oh yeah, this is a Ceanothus. It has a single midvein. Or, oh yeah, this is a Ceanothus. I kind of recognize this inflorescence shape, this collection of flowers. And ooh, this one has 3 midveins. So that clues you in on how to start looking for these in the key. Here's another one that I really like in our chaparral habitats, Picaringia montana. That's kind of a fun name to say, Picaringia montana. Anyway, classic pea-shaped flowers, but it's exquisite. Look how beautiful it is. Look at how complex it is with these broad pink banners. Big pink banner that has this yellow guide for a pollinator. Oh, I need to be pollinated right down there. The wings are kind of pressed, and there's a keel down in there hiding, being protected by the wings. It's a really cool plant, as is this, Garrya elliptica, the silk tassel bush. I just bought one of these this weekend because it's so intriguing with these long catkins, these long dangly inflorescence shapes, these long dangly inflorescences. Now this is a plant that is dioecious. It has male staminate flowers that only produce pollen and female pistillate flowers that only produce seeds. This has to cross-pollinate. How do I know this is a female? Well, each individual flower as it matures is going to bulge with seeds and just be fatter and rounder. Compare this inflorescence shape to this one. And you can really see here, well, it's kind of hard in this picture, but you can, if you're up close and personal, see the stamens. It's very cool. Here's another beautiful flower, the pitcher sage that's typical in chaparral habitats. Look at how hairy these sepals are. The sepals are collectively known as the calyx. The calyx encloses the bud of the flower. When the calyx opens to reveal the flower as it matures, it separates into these sepals. Look at how hairy they are. There's this maroon color. It's just such a nice complement to this pink of the pitcher sage. Really cool. This is an interesting plant. Indian warrior, Pedicularis densiflora. It looks superficially like a paintbrush, and it's in the same family. It also has flowers that are hiding inside these big, showy maroon bracts, these modified leaves. It also is parasitic or hemiparasitic, partially parasitic. It has leaves that produce chlorophyll, but that are green and have chlorophyll, the pigment, but it also has these reddish maroon modified leaves, these bracts, and these little speckly white things are the flowers hiding in between the bracts. It's fascinating. Pedicularis probably is parasitic on manzanitas, but I'm not sure for a fact. Now, in very specialized habitats in the maritime chaparral, we have this really cool plant called beargrass, Xerophyllum tenax. Used to be in the lily family, but it's been broken out into a different family now. This plant here in Monterey County reaches its southernmost distribution in the western US. It only occurs in a few places here in Monterey County. It's really common in the Rockies. It's really common in Northern California, but not here in Monterey County. To my knowledge, it only occurs in 3 places: in the maritime chaparral of Fort Ord, in the Del Monte Forest in some maritime chaparral, and in a tiny little spot south of Bixby Creek. Now, this particular plant here in Monterey County only flowers after it's burned. So it's highly adapted to very specialized kinds of habitats. If you see this, you know you're either in Del Monte Forest or Fort Ord or south of Bixby Bridge. It's really interesting. Super important as a fiber plant. Native Americans used it extensively in basketry and actually had an ethnology where they purposefully burned areas. They purposely induced fire in areas where beargrass was growing, which would stimulate it to actually produce really fresh and more pliable leaves so that they could weave with that and weave their baskets. So moving into another habitat, and we're gonna probably have to postpone some of this for next week, but moving into another habitat, oak woodlands, savannas, and grasslands. So these are structural terms. These are habitats dominated by grasses. These are habitats dominated by grasses with an occasional oak. And these are habitats dominated by oak trees. So in this image, what we're looking at are grasslands. We're looking at sort of a savanna here. It's really more of a grassland with scattered trees. We're looking at oak woodlands in these canyons. And we're looking at, in this case, coastal scrub. This is actually a photograph from the Big Sur Land Trust's Marks Ranch before it burned in the last river fire. What are the wildflowers we're going to see in these habitats? Oh, beautiful things like shooting stars, which had its name recently changed to primula, as opposed to dodecatheon, which is a far more fun name to say. Dodecatheon, 5 syllables, dodecatheon. Oh my gosh. Primula, they changed the name to primula because it's one of the first things to flower in the spring. Primula, primary. I guess that's Latin for first, or I think it's first. Yeah. Look at how complex these flowers are with these backwards facing or recurved petals. This fringe on the edge of the petals that's yellow. And then all the reproductive parts of the flower in here. Just an amazingly beautiful flower that you need to look at carefully, up close and personal, to really appreciate how complex it is. They come in all different colors, from magenta to light pink to white, and really, really dark, stunning purple. Lupin, typical in our oak woodlands, our oak savannas, and our grassland habitats, really likes grassy, open, sunny, particularly south-facing aspects, but you can find it on the north sides of grassy areas too. Lupinus nanus in this case, a very interesting inflorescence with individual flowers that have this touch of white. When this touch of white attracts a pollinator, and remember, they're seeing this in a spectrum that our eyes are not seeing this in. They're seeing different colors and different kinds of things than we are. When this white is seen by a pollinator and the pollinator manages to get into the flower to pollinate it, this white turns purple. It's very interesting. It actually goes through a color change, and it signals then the pollinators that come after, hey, don't bother, I'm done. Go pollinate something that's white, right? Don't pollinate me, I'm finished. So it's an interesting adaptation to a coevolution with pollinators, indicating, or creating a mechanism for the pollinators to conserve their energy. How do you know what lupin you're looking at? Well, environmental context. Lupinus nanus in sunny grassy places, and Lupinus latifolius, the broadleaf lupin, in a slightly more shady environment. Looks really similar, doesn't it? With these palmate leaf arrangements and this inflorescence of stacked up individual flowers that have white and then also purpley, indicating pollinated individual flowers. How do you know what lupin you're looking at? Oh my God, there's so many lupins. In Monterey County, we have 27 different ones. Some have spindly spider-like leaves. Some have big broad leaves like the harlequin lupin, very easy to identify because the only yellow and magenta one, it's gorgeous. Some have white flowers like the gully lupin. And notice the stacking up of the inflorescence here of the individual flowers. The gully lupin inflorescence is shaped much different than the Nuttall's annual lupin or the tree lupin. Environmental context and a little bit of work helps you key them out. A couple more lupin, the Santa Lucia lupin, endemic to the Santa Lucia range, occurs at our higher elevations. And then the stinging lupin that has all these little trichomes, these stinging hairs on the stems and on the leaves. They're also on the seed pods. And I made the mistake once of collecting some of the seed pods that have these fine little trichomes, these stinging hairs on there. And I put these seed pods, classic of the Fabaceae, the pea family, in my pocket. I was gonna take them home and plant them. And they stung my leg really bad. So I had to literally take my pocket inside out and dump the seeds out and leave my pocket inside out while I went home. Other interesting things, Salvia spathacea, the hummingbird sage, beautiful magenta, highly sticky, resinous, full of volatile oils, creating smell and terpenes that are resisting herbivores, resisting things that might nibble on these. Stunning purple flower, dark pink flowers on these purple bracts that hold them. It's interesting too, the foliage, the leaves with their whorled habitat. Here you can see opposite leaves that when they're compressed seem to whorl or spin around the plant. These opposite leaves are arranged ever so slightly in a spiral as they move up the plant, so that each set of alternating opposite leaves doesn't shade the ones below it from the sun. They're off kilter in a spiral ever so slightly so they can maximize their sunlight. The foliage also is really pungent, and if you cut some of these leaves up and add them to like a pretty bland cookie, like a shortbread cookie, they'll flavor the shortbread cookie in a really nice way. So I've done that before. I've actually harvested some of the leaves and chopped them up and put them in my batter of shortbread, which is just white flour, butter, and sugar. And it makes a really good flavor. So it's 6:30, and I have quite a bit more in this particular lecture. This happened last year as well, where we had to continue next week. But we're going to finish this sort of habitat perspective next week, looking at different wildflowers, and there'll be some time at the end. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here so we can see. I want to ask you guys, we'll take a democratic vote. In the last half hour of next week, do you want to hear about edible plants, foraging in your backyard? Or would you be more interested in hearing about fire followers and the kinds of wildflowers that occur for a very short period of time in a burst of energy after a wildfire burns through an area? This year is going to be particularly interesting because of all the different fires that we've had. Okay, Cheryl says fire followers. We only have Ellie and Lindsay to vote. What do you guys
I agree. Fire followers. That would be
okay.
great.
Yeah.
How about you, Ellie?
Oh, I'm down for, I want to know both, but I also, I know Nikki, so I can just harass her at some point.
You can.
May I tell a quick short story about fire followers?
Absolutely.
I was down in Big Sur after the fire before Sobranas. Which one was that, Nikki? Help me.
Basin Complex in 2008.
Basin Complex, yep. And I was driving along the Old Coast Road and I kept getting out and looking for fire followers, fire flowers. And there was another man there doing the same thing. And after about, maybe half an hour, 45 minutes, we just started talking, and it turned out that it was Les Roundtree.
Oh my.
Yes, and we became acquaintances, got together later, and Carmel went out to dinner and just talked about his mom. And anyway, if you don't know who Les Roundtree is, I had no idea who she was, but oh my gosh, because of you, I connected with those women and introduced everyone here to her book in our book group last year.
Yeah.
So, fire followers, yes.
Cool. That's neat.
I would think
Ellie,
like Kashawa should be pretty good this year, right? Kashawa, Tassajara.
Yeah, not to Sahara so much because it really didn't burn up there, but areas around Kashawa, Sky Ranch. I know that the roads in the National Forest burn areas are still closed. But if you know anybody that lives in the Las Palmas or Pine Canyon area in the Salinas Valley, should be awesome. I have some great photographs from that 2008 Basin Complex fire and the fire followers that I saw in and around Tassajara. So those are the things I'll be talking about.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, some intro on fire frequency, and it's really interesting how often it's burned here in our Santa Lucia Mountains just in the last, 50 years. It's amazing. Cool. Okay, well, nice to see you guys. And we will pick this up again next week on Tuesday at 6:30 and keep going with, starting with goldfields and finish up our habitat perspective and different wildflowers and habitats. And do like a little like teaser on fire followers.
Great. I'm looking forward to it. Thank
Great.
you.
All right, thank you.
Nikki.
And see you later. Bye,
Bye.
Ellie.
Have a good night, everyone.